All right. Is everyone there?
Yeah.
Hello.
Abram, you
Yes,
there?
I'm here.
All right, cool. Tony, we're going to jump in the interest of time. So,
Wait, so are
Abram,
we not doing any read through? We're just going right off the thing?
We're just going to go right off.
All right. Without a net. All right, give me one quick second here. Hi, Tony. How you doing? Well,
I'm good.
No, save that question for
okay.
the
Save
call.
that question. Okay.
I'm not going to say I'm good on the call because I'm not really good.
Okay.
Oh. All right, here we go. Welcome to The Radical Bureaucrat, a podcast for people who want to change institutions from the inside.
It is the afternoon of Tuesday, March 17th, and New York City is essentially on day 2 of lockdown, day 2 depending on when you start counting. I want to start off with something that's a little bit embarrassing. Yesterday, Abram, I suggested that we brag on each other, and after we recorded it, my wife pointed out that this protocol we use for bragging on each other that I got from the Sunstorm podcast, it's actually intended to give space for women to step into their power, to put aside humility and own their accomplishments that is so often done by men, where men are given space to, celebrate themselves. So I feel like I kind of inadvertently appropriated that protocol for us, two cisgendered men, which is a bit embarrassing, but I think it's okay. I just wanted to acknowledge where that protocol comes from.
Wow. I had no idea. I guess I'm guilty by association. I'm somehow an accomplice in the, thanks, Sam. In all seriousness, I've realized a ton over the last several months, in particular, like just how often I'm the talking man that feels completely comfortable throwing my talking manness into the mix. Meanwhile, other people are struggling, with, whether or not what they say will be received and whether or not they have enough evidence yet, or they should just play it safe. And, I don't really think about a lot of that. And a lot of that is because how I was enculturated. So apologies for myself as a tall talker man. And on behalf of the greater talker man nation, many of whom probably won't apologize, but we'll work on them. Sam and I will work on them.
Yeah. And this is what happens when we go live and unedited.
That's right.
And it's also, at the same time, I still think it's a great protocol. I think that we recognize where it comes from, and it's also always good to celebrate your friends. And so that's what we were doing. But listen, today we are on with our very good friend and friend of the podcast, Toni Smith-Thompson. I have no problem bragging on Toni. Toni is, like me, a public school parent, a founding member of the steering committee of the Alliance for School Integration and Desegregation, like Abram and myself. She's an organizer with the NYCLU. She's a writer, and she's a lifelong activist. Toni speaks and writes on issues of equity and justice with a particular focus on public education, free speech, and sickle cell anemia. She first made a big public splash in 2003 when she was a college basketball player and engaged in a protest during the national anthem in opposition to the war in Iraq. And that was long before Kaepernick.
Long before.
Toni is wise beyond her years. She's caring, and she brings an equity lens to any space she is in. So we're really happy to have you. Welcome, Toni.
Yay,
Thanks.
Toni,
Thanks for having me back on the pod. I'm so excited this
Woo-hoo.
podcast is back up and running.
Yeah. Well, technically, you've been on 2 of the last 3 episodes now.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Snaps for that.
Y'all can hear her.
Thanks
on
for
the finale
reading my
of-
whole bio. I really needed that today.
Good. Yes, that's why we brag on each other.
Yeah.
So we just want to start by asking you, how are you? What's going on?
I'm taking it day by day. Each day is different. Yeah, some days have been close to panic, and other days there are moments of light. And I think for me, particularly because of the line of work I'm in, I guess, some of the intense worrying is about the public health crisis. But then there's also, on the other side, this real concern about our democracy, civil liberties, people's rights in this time, and really not knowing at any one moment which one to be more concerned about. Like at the moment, courthouses are closing or closed, legislative sessions are ending, budgets are being passed without public process. People are remaining in incarcerated settings. And so it's hard enough to balance those two every day with our actions, but now needing to hold both in our emotions as well, and also, caring for our own families. It's hard.
Yeah, for sure. So, and I think one of the tensions of this podcast, tensions really for any activist in all of our work is balancing a conversation between the systemic and the structural, and what's swirling all around us and wanting to change those things, and the personal dynamic. And so we wanted to ask you, and you can answer this as a parent, as an individual, as an activist, as an organizer, but however you want to come to the question, we wanted to ask you, what is one important challenge that you as an individual are facing today that you're thinking about, this afternoon?
One particular challenge that I'm facing among many is I'm an organizer by profession, but I'm also an organizer in my spare time, as we all are. And one challenge is, how do we, or I, maintain or harness the organizing work that has been built over the last however many years you want to start counting from. For many people and many movements, organizing has happened for generations. And in more discrete movements, and I'll speak for myself, a lot of the organizing work that I've been doing has particularly come about post-Trump election. And so I think for a lot of people, there has been a particular organizing momentum built around these particular 4 years. And we are now in the home stretch of those 4 years. And we are at great risk of having a lot of that momentum being undone very quickly.
And what is
this crisis?
What is it that will undo? Like well, I guess two questions. One, what are some of the specific progress that we're, could have made, but then we're not going to do it now because we're going through this kind of emergency abrupt process and closing all the doors?
Well, in New York City, for example, and the collective we have made a lot of progress bringing to the forefront the conversation of race and inequity, the state of segregation in our schools, the lack of funding, the ways that our curricula doesn't center students of color, right? So we have made all of these great gains, and in the moment, it seems very difficult to keep those issues front and center. It's almost like, is there room in the public discourse for both public health crisis and racism, which there has to be because they're interconnected, right? And this is absolutely connected. But for specific campaigns, like part of my work is to pass state legislation to reduce the use of suspensions as a form of discipline in schools. What happens to that bill? What happens to the efforts of people working to reform bail at the moment? There are all of these movements that were really close to being done and being done well, that are up in the air now.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that big time. And it's so many different fronts. The more time you spend understanding how the current systems and structures work, the more you realize it really is everywhere. It is endemic, to use a different demic word than the one we've been using lately. That it really is baked into the core essence of a lot of things. And so, so many different issues. And then, suddenly it's kind of like that moment in Wayne's World where the car stops the hockey game. Car, everything is going to stop. But But these issues are still issues, particularly when you talk about like people are still in prison cells right now, right? And where there's, there's clear evidence of what the healthcare setup is like there, and how that looks and works.
Yeah.
So like, can we also talk about that? Let not lose sight of that.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, I feel some tension of like, but also, God, you got to focus on something, and so some things are gonna fall by the way. I don't know. It's tough.
Yeah, and I think another thing that's being highlighted a lot right now is how much our structures and systems are arbitrary, right? Like a lot of these punitive systems are not rooted in kind of sound public health or sound democracy, and so. In the education context, for example, right, attendance for this year is not going to count for anything stakes-based. State tests are being waived until whenever. And so you begin to see that a lot of these reforms that advocates have been pushing for, because they are good policies to promote equity, are now being waived because they're not that important right now, right? And they were never that important in the ways that they were being used. And so it's infuriating to one degree to know that at any moment these decisions could be made, right? Like you see cities are finding housing for people who don't have housing so that they can have places to practice social distancing, right? Well, if you could find housing now, you could have found housing a month ago, a year ago.
Right. And so these things that progressives have been pushing for are all of a sudden becoming possible. And is there a way in which that gives you some optimism? Like I saw this morning, de Blasio, I don't know when he said it, the Mayor de Blasio said today or yesterday that we could be facing something akin to the Great Depression. Yeah. And we know that out of the Great Depression came tremendous suffering, but also, our entire social safety net, basically. And granted, some of those programs were implemented in a very racist and unequal way. And yet, from a progressive standpoint, and when we think about them, there were also so much good government came out of that period. So does that give you any sense of hope for the future?
Yeah, it does. A couple of days ago, I was sort of in a really low emotional space a couple of days ago. Kind of the first day that I kept my kids home from school was on Friday before the schools officially closed. And I was just already beginning to mourn everything that we were going to lose. And then kind of inside of that, as I began to see some of the other changes like attendance and state tests and how the state was responding to that, I began to think about it in the other way, which was actually out of this, what are the reforms that we're getting now in the midst of a public health crisis that we could hold on to? What are the organizing strategies that we can begin to develop now that can hold on to these reforms for after this moment has passed? And what other reforms could we push for now that we can hold on to there, right? Like right now there are like stops on evictions and kind of like immediate unemployment benefits, right? Like there are some of these practices.
We're talking about what in essence is universal basic income in a lot of places, which is supposedly impossible. So it's almost as if the virus has caused us to input the cheat codes on the made up money system that we have. And then when it's all over, we're all supposed to go back and pretend like we didn't live with universal basic income and with like.
But we're not going to. No, I really think that there's going to be before and after, right? And we just don't know what the after will look like.
We don't know what the after.
I guess I'm bracing for the pushback on all of that, right? Because the bottom line is that in order to pay for all of that stuff, the economy's got to, be reconfigured, right? And that reconfiguring is something that people are going to have a lot of thoughts and opinions and power and money to influence.
Yeah. So I want to bring it back, Toni, just to, I get it that things are moving so fast and our headspace is in a different place every day and our work looks different every day right now. But tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing with the NYCLU. without however specific you want to be, but what did today look like? Like, what are you trying to do in your organizing work?
Today, so this week, I'm doing a lot of fact finding. So for my organization, I'm really trying to help the organization get a handle on what's happening in New York City, but also in school districts across the state. How are teachers preparing for remote learning? How is that looking different in the public school, charter school, and private school sectors? What are resources that are being made available that will be free and available to anybody who wants it? Kind of like asking educators, what are the other places where we can look ahead and begin to think about advocacy going forward for after this, such as what is this going to mean for graduation requirements for kids who are going to need to graduate and aren't going to be meeting benchmarks in the same way because we're not in school? What are the ways we ensure that students in schools are not penalized for what is happening now? So beginning to kind of piece together what are the gaps and what are the holes that we're going to need to fill looking ahead a little bit more. I'm also doing some thinking about how the kind of parent school desegregation movement spaces can show up in these times. Is there a way to sort of harness those spaces to kind of virtually desegregate? Is there a way we can connect across schools? Is there a way we can kind of share resources in virtual ways, in the ways that we can? Or are there ways that parents can show up to ensure that, you know, many people are doing this already, but like harnessing the school desegregation movement to show up for groceries and money and other ways to support. So a lot of it is like triage, kind of rethinking what the work is going to look like for the coming months, and maybe longer.
Right.
There's actually something else that I thought of that's really related to this podcast that I wanted to share also. And that is, in this moment, the ways in which bureaucracies function has been totally flipped over. And so I've been talking to friends in nonprofits, but also in the private sector about how different institutions are being reconfigured or recreated in this moment. And so at my organization, we're all, of course, working remotely, and we're on conference calls all day, video calls. But a lot of the traditional bureaucratic systems are not functioning the way that they've always functioned because they can't. Right. Checks and balances are not happening the same way. Decision making is not happening in the same way. Right. So a lot of that is still being figured out. But in the meantime, what's happening is that there's a lot more autonomy for individual staff members to create and do their work. And there has to be a lot more trust. Like there just has to be trust that your staff wants to do the work, that they want to show up in this moment, and that they want to connect. And so a lot of the things that kind of hold big bureaucracies back from doing their most and best work don't exist right now. And I think, so that's what I'm seeing in my organization, but I've also talked to friends who are in the private sector for whom maybe that's different, right? For whom they're just retreating. Don't do anything. Nobody do anything. And so it's been interesting. I was thinking today, it's really interesting to see how different big institutions either kind of rise up or retreat back in time and how that impacts the work.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think that it's almost like you come to a crossroads as a leader in an institution at a time like this. Are you going to err on the side of trusting your staff and giving them and bringing them into the fold and saying, look, it's all hands on deck and this is a challenge we're dealing with and I need you to figure out where you fit in? Or are you going to pull back and say your work is not relevant right now? And so...
Yeah, and I can't focus on managing it.
Go into a holding pattern.
Yeah.
Was that, Abram?
Yeah, and I can't summon the time or energy to manage it. You've just got to figure it out.
Right.
Yeah, I think this is a big...
Or I can't summon the time or energy to manage it, so you just got to wait.
Yeah, exactly.
Like until I have
that time. Yeah, and don't do that, but wait. Yeah, I think this is a real moment for managers and leaders everywhere, whether it's a small group of people or a large organization. I think what you do in this time and place, and this is a note that I heard the governor echo for the first time today. And maybe he's done it before, I don't know, but I've been saying this for several months, that like The stuff that we're doing right now, this is history. And like our grandkids are going to tell stories about what we decided to do right now. And that is true right now with this epidemic or whatever, more than it has been. It's like so intensely true right now. And in the middle of that, I think a lot of what drives that, what you're talking about, Toni, is really management fear, where, in the business, the private sector in particular, you don't want to risk capital. Like if something bad is going on, just shut down. That's safer because then you'll have capital when the smoke clears. And then because of that impulse, that's what's happening in the stock market. Liquidate, withdraw.
Yeah.
And in the public sector, we have this immense responsibility to protect and serve and right, in some cases save people from the situations that they're in, right? And that, in some jobs, like say a police officer, I was just texting my a friend of mine who I used to mentor when he was a student, who is in his second year, I believe, on the force. And, the communications that he's getting about what it's going to look like for the next 45 plus days, right? Like that is a kind of serving the public. But then at the same time, like attending to these issues of the schools, of what are healthcare workers' children going to do during the day over the next 45 years. Those issues are also critically important. And so then there's this feeling of, it's a fear, it's a management fear. It's a feeling of, well, I have to get it right. I can't get it wrong. So I'm going to withdraw and I'm going to make the decision on my own. And I get it. I've been there. I've done that. But what Sam is describing, this world of bringing people into the fold, letting people know what's going on, letting people know the decision is hard and you haven't made it yet, but you're willing to listen, that's tough. That's tough when things are time sensitive. It's tough. Yeah. And what we do, I think, is going to echo. This is it. We're making history.
Yeah. And everything is time sensitive right now.
Yep.
10 times more than
legitimately time
before.
sensitive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And Abram works for the Office of Equity and Access, which turns out I'm working with closely, and we talk about in their workshops what are the situations, what kind of an environment causes people to revert to their implicit biases and not have any awareness of that they're acting upon their biases.
Yeah, it's ambiguous.
That's happening
ambiguous
right now, especially for leaders, right, who have high stress, have very little time. Like that's when it's so important to slow down. And yet, how do you do that when there's so much pressure and so much flying at you? It's a real challenging time.
And you know what? I have to say, typically I'm pretty critical of quote unquote leadership. I think in these times, I'm seeing people rise to the occasion on a lot of different levels and a lot of different stories. And so, that feels like a lot of pressure, but, we just have to face it, it's going to be okay. And if we make mistakes, it's fine. It's going to be fine. We're going to get through it. But let's not do the bunker thing where we lock ourselves in our offices, and like, don't tell anyone what the word is, Yeah.
Yeah.
So Toni, we just want to ask before we let you go, what's one thing that's bringing you a sense of calm in the midst of all this? And I know it's hard, but what's one thing that helps?
Actually, the work. I was at my lowest over the weekend before Monday, where I really got to reconnect with all of my colleagues in this new reality and redefine what my work was going to look like. And once I had a clear idea that I had a purpose, that I have a way that I can contribute, I was immediately calmer. And so one of the first things that I'm prioritizing in the midst of the organizing work, another thing that I'm doing this week is I'm working on writing a piece, right, about this moment, which I hope will run somewhere related to work, which I think it will. But really kind of rethinking, I think for many people, this moment highlights the type of collective action or collective responsibility that is essential, that we talk about in our education organizing spaces, right? Like getting people to understand how their individual choices affect the collective. And now for many people who are not often directly impacted by matters of race and class are really affected by this. And I think that's one piece of it. And the other piece of it is kind of I think the narrative in the public discourse over the last few decades, which has been really, really hard on the education sector, really hard on teachers, really hard on parents and students in terms of accountability measures. There have been attacks on like teachers' labor rights and kind of, high stakes measures that are really punitive on teachers, parents, and students. And I think what this moment is highlighting is that schools have been created as places not just for education, but as essential community spaces for food and healthcare and childcare, right, and community. And those are equally important, but schools are not appreciated for that the way they are held accountable to academic standards. And in this moment, one of the kind of the biggest concerns that came to the forefront when deciding whether to close schools was about childcare services and food and healthcare, right? Even though the education is critical, we have to acknowledge that schools play a much larger part. And suddenly, in kind of like the public discourse, you see a lot more appreciation for what teachers do. You see a lot more appreciation for, I hope, right, we're seeing much more appreciation for what it means to show up every day when you're living with trauma and when you're living without health care, when you're living with food insecurity and housing insecurity. And I know there are many parents at home these days that are suddenly not being as productive with their kids as they normally are when they're the ones that have to 100% manage trauma and life and your kids' academics. It's hard. And we're not always, as a collective, empathetic to that.
Yeah. Well, purpose is everything. It's kind of the big theme of this podcast. Like, we need to have that purpose, and it clearly comes across in your words. So, we thank you for your time, Toni. We wish you and your family the best. And it's great to talk to you. Love you.
Yeah, you too. Love you too.
Love you so much, Toni. Stay safe.
It's good to talk to you.
It's good to talk to you.
Bye, Toni.
Bye.
All right, so Abram, there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. All right, so let's do it. Let's end like good radicals. What's one thing you learned today that you can use to create a more just and equitable world?
The one thing I heard and I took note of to mention at this part of the podcast was that that Toni really had to take some time to be at that low point. And I, that's not like a one-time thing necessarily, but I think sometimes
I'm losing you, Abram. I hope it's not the recording. You still there?
Yeah, no, I'm still here. The recording's
All right,
probably
can
fine.
you say it again?
Yeah, I think the thing that I heard Toni say is that she had to spend some time in that low point. And, I think we're going to have to think about how we make time and space for that grieving, and then return back to that purpose that you sort of highlighted as the theme of what Toni had to share. But like, I think I want to make sure that I put a pin in, like, okay, people need to make space to kind of like feel and worry and whatever else, and grieve, but also, return to purpose, because that's where, that's where hope is going to come from, I think, is from returning to that sense of purpose and having something to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm really, I'm glad you phrased it that way. Cause I was latching on to the purpose, but I think you're right that she took a step before she went to the purpose, and how that kind of filled a void for her. And I just think that for us, I'm so fortunate that I feel so fortunate to have this podcasting space with you, because right now my 9 to 5 looks different. Like I don't work on the instructional side, and so all of the energy in the Department of Education is being put right now into setting up remote learning, and that's not my area. I'd like to help, I really would, but it's not where, it's not my expertise. It's not what I'm being asked to do right now, and so I feel like I have less purpose than I did a few weeks ago in my regular work. I also have lost things in my life, like we're scrambling trying to figure out, okay, so what is it going to mean to work towards school integration, like Toni was talking about, and she's thinking about it. But there's, what we were doing before is not relevant. We're not organizing meetings right now.
Right.
And I don't have Little League baseball, right? And so my purpose that I am finding meaning and fulfillment from is really about my family. And I'm glad that this podcast is helping me to think outwardly and think about the collective, and hopefully, touch people or make a difference through the guests that we bring on, the conversations that we have. And to me, the kind of struggle of my whole career and has been finding that purpose. And when I find it, and when I'm able to take an opportunity to actually work towards it, it means everything. And when I don't have it is when I hit my lowest point. And so I can really relate to what Toni was saying there.
Yeah. Let me throw in a comment here, and then we'll end like good bureaucrats. Sam will read the disclaimer.
Sure. Okay.
But I wanted to toss in that please reach out if you're listening to this and you have something you'd like to share about this intersection of the public sector and how we thrive and survive together, love each other, how we be good to each other. Let us know. Come to Twitter. It's at RADBUREAU, Rad Bureau. You can look it up on the Google, the Radical Bureaucrat. Reach out. If you have show ideas or questions, comments, reach out.
Yeah, and we have a website.
The radicalbureaucrat.com.
There's a blog. You can contact us through the website, radicalbureaucrat.com. So we're going to end by being good bureaucrats. The views expressed here are personal opinions and do not reflect the official or unofficial position of any government agency, policy, party, leader, or really anyone besides the two of us, and maybe you, but maybe not. This content has not been sponsored or approved by anyone and was mostly just made because we wanted an opportunity to talk about things that matter to everyone, whether they realize it or not. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening, everyone.